All right, we are ready for Jeremiah chapters 38 to 41 in this survey. We have some visitors with us, and so you will be able to keep up with us. We are in our Bible survey, making our way through Jeremiah. This Wednesday night material is taught more in sermon or lecture format, so that's how we're presenting this. We have a handout we've given out. If you care to follow with that, you don't have to have that, but some like to use that to follow along. Be that as it may, here's our outline that we're following on the book of Jeremiah. And I like what Wiersbe does with this, the national, personal, and international section. We are in that second section, the personal section of Jeremiah's suffering. We're going to see him in a dungeon, in a cistern tonight. He was arrested last week. We'll go back and catch a little of that here in just a moment to catch us up. But chapters 34 to 39 in this midsection deals with before the siege of Jerusalem. And then in chapter 39 is when Jerusalem is penetrated, the walls of the city are penetrated and it falls. And then chapter 40 is after the siege, after the fall, then now what takes place? And we'll pick up with that. Now we won't finish that section obviously, we're getting 40 and 41 and we'll get into the rest of that in our study next time. And then we're ready for the international section as we talk about the nation sections in nearly every prophet. Here is a summary. And you're looking for this in your handout if you're following the handout. We're looking for a summary of each one of these chapters, kind of something that does summarize what basically is each of these chapters all about. Well, remember there's a dividing line between 39 and 40 from before the siege and after the siege, but be that as it may, chapter 38 basically is about Jeremiah being in a dungeon or a cistern, a deep cistern that has no water, but it's got mud in the bottom of it, and that's where they put him. And then he's pulled out of that we see that in chapter 39. Chapter 38. 39 is Jerusalem is captured. This is the fall of Jerusalem. There have been two invasions prior to this. This is the third and final invasion when the city falls and is burned with fire and the temple is destroyed. We see more about this in other chapters. We'll get to those chapters which are parallel in a few moments. And then also Jeremiah is set free. He is in prison as the chapter opens up. He's put down in this dungeon and then he lifted out of that, but he's still a prisoner and now he's set free in chapter 39. Well, chapter 40 is about Jeremiah being freed, picking up with this after the siege, and he dwells at Mizpah. And we see what takes place in chapter 40. And then we see Gedaliah, who was the governor appointed by the king, is assassinated, which he had been told that was in the plans and in the plotting, and yet he didn't accept that, and yet he faced assassination. So those are the basic summaries of chapters 38 to 41. If you didn't get all of that, you can pick that up as we go along. So let's talk about chapter 37. The chapter 37 you covered last week. I wasn't here. I was out sick, and Dathan covered chapters 34 through 37 with you. But I just want to kind of lace chapters 38 to 41 back into chapter 37 just for a moment. You remember in chapter 37 that Zedekiah, he's the last king of the southern kingdom of Judah, is seeking help from Jeremiah. There was a lull in the siege, as you'll remember. And as Nebuchadnezzar is making his way in this siege, that the Egyptians are coming, and they turn to give their attention to the Egyptians, and consequently there's a lull in the siege, and that is misinterpreted as Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians are leaving. They're gone. They're not, and so this battle is over. And so Jeremiah was wrong about all this. And so Jeremiah tries to assure Zedekiah, that's not happening. He's coming back. The city's going to be burned. You're going to be taken captive, etc. Here's the problems that are going on. But you remember in chapter 37 at verse 13, there was one who cried out saying to Jeremiah, you are defecting to the Chaldeans. We'll see more about that charge here in a moment. And so they arrested Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is taken and he's kept in prison, in the court of the prison, according to verse 31. Zedekiah had asked this question back in verse 17, is there any word from the Lord? In other words, what he's hoping, we're going to see this in chapter 38 a little bit later, that what Zedekiah is hoping is that Jeremiah changes his message, and that his message is that Nebuchadnezzar's gone and things are not going to happen. That's what he's hoping. But Jeremiah never changes his message. This is the word from the Lord. Babylon is coming. Jerusalem is going to fall. You're going to be taken captive. You've got a choice. You either yield or it's going to be worse. And so he asked him, is there any word from the Lord? Well, yeah, same word. Same word. And he asked again about that. We're going to see that in chapter 38. So that's chapter 37 now, which you've already covered. Jeremiah's arrested and he's in prison. Now then, we have in chapter 38, Jeremiah's accused of treason and he's cast in a dungeon. So two major things happen in this chapter. Jeremiah is rescued from the dungeon by Ebed-Melech. And so let's talk about what we see in chapter 38. There are several men that are mentioned, starting with Shephatiah, Gedaliah, and Jucal, and Pashur are mentioned here in the context. They had heard the words that Jeremiah had spoken to the people, probably alluding not only to the recent words, but words that had been said back in chapter 21. Back in chapter 21 is where the message had been given. Jerusalem is going to fall, and it's going to fall with Zedekiah being the leader, and the city is going to be burned. And they had heard all of these words. And they said, they heard the words of Jeremiah where he had said, now at verse 2, thus says the Lord, those who remain in the city shall die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. And he who goes over to the Chaldeans shall live. In other words, submit to the Chaldeans because that's God's plan for them to come. And he shall have his life as a price. Verse 3, thus says the Lord, the city shall utterly be given to the hand of the king of Babylon, to his army, which shall take it. Now notice at verse 4. Verse 4, therefore the princes said, please let this man, they said to the king, that is to Zedekiah, let this man be put to death, for he has weakened, notice the two things they say, he's weakened the hand of the men of war who remain in the city, and the hand of all the people, by speaking such words to them, for this man does not seek the welfare of this people, but their harm. Half of what they said was true, and half was wrong. What half was true? Well, he's weakened, their charge was, he's weakened the hands, or discouraged the hands of the men of war. Those men in the city who were set ready to fight against Nebuchadnezzar, he's discouraged them by telling them, submit. And they're right about that charge. That's what he was hoping to do. Submit to them instead of fighting against Nebuchadnezzar. And so they're right about that charge. The second thing, though, was false, which was, for this man does not seek their welfare of the people, but their harm. And I'm learning something very practical from that. The true message will be perverted and misunderstood. The Lord's message was perverted and misunderstood. When you teach someone the gospel, they'll probably pervert it and misunderstand it. Don't get discouraged about that because they did with Jeremiah, they did with the Lord, they did with the apostles, they do with all of us. And so they took the message, and part of what they said was true, mixed some conclusion with that, which was not justified, and said, this is what's going on with Jeremiah. He is not seeking their welfare, but he's seeking their harm. No, he was seeking their welfare because he was simply revealing the will of the Lord. Now, that was the charge. So verses 1 to 4, the princes wanted to kill Jeremiah. So Jeremiah verses 5 and 6 was cast in a cistern. Now take note of verse 5. We're going to contrast it to verse 10 in a moment. You're looking for this in your handout. That Zedekiah the king said, look, he is in your hand, for the king can do nothing against it. Y'all just do whatever you want to with him. Well, that's real leadership, isn't it? That's real backbone. When he really knows that Jeremiah's telling the truth, y'all just do whatever you want to with Jeremiah. He's in your hand. You do whatever you want with him. And y'all do what you want. He's spineless and refuses to take a stand about that. So what they do, verse 6, they took Jeremiah and cast him in a dungeon. In other words, a cistern. It didn't have any water. We'll see in just a moment. And they let Jeremiah down with ropes into the dungeon. It had no water and there was mire, so Jeremiah sank down in the mire. This is a famine going on, by the way, in the midst. Not mentioned directly right here. There's a famine going on, mentioned earlier, by the way, in chapter 37. And they said the bread's playing out in the city, verse 20 and 21 of chapter 37. And they put Jeremiah down there. And so a little bit later, there's a concern that he's going to die down there because they're not going to have anything to eat. And that's where he is. Now, Let's get to verses 7 to 13. There is a man named Ebed-Melech. Let's see who he is and what's going on. At verse 7, he's an Ethiopian. He's not an Israelite. Here's something very practical to learn from this. Jeremiah was forsaken by his own people, by his own kin. But he finds friends among the Gentiles. This man was of Ethiopia. He was one of the eunuchs of the king's house. And so he comes to the king and says to the king, they've cast Jeremiah down in this prison, he'll die from hunger. For there's no more bread in the city. There's a famine going on. They put him down there. He's not going to have any food, and he's going to die. So now notice verse 10. The king commanded Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, saying, take with you 30 men. Perhaps that's for security. And with you, and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he dies. Now that's quite interesting. Contrast verse 5 to verse 10, and you see Zedekiah seems to be fickle. Over here he said, y'all do whatever you think you want to do with him. And he knows they're wanting to kill him, so they put him down in the dungeon. And then here comes this Ethiopian and said, you know what, he's going to die if we don't get him out. Well, get him out then. Get him out. It reminds me of some politician. If the wind's blowing this way, then that's the way I want to go. And as soon as the wind shifts the other way, well, then I'm on this side over here too. He's fickle and he's spineless and he's lacking courage. He's not much of a leader. There's a footnote to be made here. Hopefully this doesn't apply to the eldership here, because that would indict me as well. But for future generations, don't be a leader in the Lord's church that you stick your finger to the wind, and if this is what everybody wants to do, that's the way we go, and if they shift in the other direction, well, then I want to be over there too. Take a stand. Have some courage. Have some backbone. And that's what he was lacking here in this context. Now then, in verse 11, he took men with him, and they took some old rags and some old clothes, and they put let him down into the dungeon and put him up under his arm so they don't hurt him when they lift him up, and they lift him out at verse 13 and put him in the court of the prison. So he's back where he started in chapter 37. So he's not in that dungeon anymore. So part of what the storyline is, starting in chapter 34, is the suffering of Jeremiah. Well, this is part of the story. Here's a man who's preached and he's preached and he's preached. He's got no converts. He's been rejected and no one to listen to him. But not only that, they mistreat him. And you think of this man who, when threatened, he keeps preaching the same message over and over and over and never gives up. Now, let's go to the end of this chapter now. Jeremiah has a final interview with Zedekiah. Now, he's been one before and one before that. But this is his third and final interview with Zedekiah. So let's go to Zedekiah's question. Beginning at verse 14. Zedekiah the king had Jeremiah the prophet brought to the third entrance of the house of the Lord. He didn't really want people to know he's talking to Jeremiah. Basically, I know it's not worded this way, but come through the back door and don't anybody know you're talking to me. And that seems to be the case. And he said, I'll ask you something and hide nothing from me. That's interesting, coming from Zedekiah. I want you to tell me the truth and nothing but the truth, and don't blow this out of proportion. Don't blow a bunch of smoke. I want to hear it straight. What does he think Jeremiah's been doing? What does he think Jeremiah's been doing? I want to hear it. I want to hear it straight, and I want you to hide nothing from me. Well, Jeremiah doesn't say, and so what is his question? It's not revealed specifically, but later in the context, I think is implied what the question was. He's wanting to know about this law in the siege. And does that mean Babylon, tell me Babylon's not coming back? Basically, I think is his question. Tell me they're not coming back. And that you were wrong, Jeremiah, about Nebuchadnezzar coming. And it's interesting, verse 15, that Jeremiah doesn't trust him. He doesn't trust Zedekiah, and for good reason. Why? Well, because he just turned the people over to kill him at verse 5. And he also knows that when somebody begged for his life, he flipped the coin and goes the other direction and had him lifted out. You can't put your confidence in this king. He knows that. So he doesn't trust him for good reason. And chapter 37, the first few verses of chapter 37, he's already revealed that whatever he says by the will of the Lord, you're not going to listen to me. And that's what he basically says to him here. He said, if I declare to you, will you not surely put me to death? And if they give you counsel, will you not... would not listen to me. You're not going to listen to whatever I tell you. I know that. That's my history with you. So Zedekiah the king said, he made a vow. This is an interesting vow. As the Lord lives, who made our very souls, I will not put you to death, nor will I give you into the hand of those men who seek your life. Basically made a vow that I'll spare your life. Now, beginning at verse 17 now, this is the answer. We're at point 2b here, Jeremiah's answer to whatever that question was. And so let's see what his answer was. His answer was, thus says the Lord, I'm reading verse 17, the God of Israel, if you surely surrender to the king of the Babylon princes. That was what he was accused of creating problems about a moment ago. Then your soul will live, and the city will not be burned with fire, and your house shall live. You've got a choice, Zedekiah. You surrender like I've been preaching to you, like God's told you, and everything's going to go well with you, and it's all going to be well. But, verse 18, if you do not surrender to the king of Babylon, the city will be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they shall burn it with fire, and you'll not escape from their hand. If you fight against him, you try to escape, it's going to get worse. Let me tell you how much worse it's going to get. So Zedekiah said to the king, I'm afraid of the Jews who have defected to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand and they abuse me. Are you kidding me? What he's saying is, I'm more fearful of the people than I am God. He's asking, is there any word from the Lord? He wants to know what God said, but his real fear is not what God says or what God's going to do or what God has promised or what God has threatened. He's more worried about the people. He's more concerned about people than he is his God. Here's a footnote. When you become more concerned about what people think and how they're going to treat you than you are what God thinks, you're not fit for the kingdom. You're not fit for the kingdom. Zedekiah is not fit for his job here either. So Jeremiah said in verse 20, they shall not deliver you. Please obey the voice of the Lord. He keeps begging him, just do what God tells you to do, and it'll be well with you. But if you refuse to surrender, verse 21, here's what's going to happen. That all the women who are left in the kings of Judah's house shall be surrendered to the king of Babylon, and those women will say, and here's a taunt song. What's a taunt song? A song that's sang in derision of one who has failed, basically. Your close friends have set upon you and prevailed against you. In other words, your friends misled you. Those that were advising you to rebel against the king, now Jeremiah was saying surrender. But those friends that told you that, they failed you. That's what that says. And your feet have sunk into the mire. In other words, you sink into the mire of a failed administration. And then thirdly, they have turned away from you. They've abandoned you. So all of those prophets that have been telling you the wrong thing and all your friends been telling you the wrong thing, they've led you to a failed administration, and now they've left you high and dry is what they've done. Now look at verse 23. Let me summarize, then we'll look at the verse and see if it doesn't say this. Your administration is about to end in total disgrace. If you just listen to God, you can surrender, and things will go well for your family. And they'll surrender your wives and your children to the Chaldeans, and you shall not escape from their hand, and you shall be taken by the hand of the king of the Babylon, and he shall cause the city to be burned with fire. When your administration comes to an end, it's going to be in total disgrace. And shame on you. What was the reaction? Well, let's get to that reaction in 24 to 28, and then we're ready for chapter 39 and see the city fall. The Zedekiah said to Jeremiah, let no one know these words, and you shall not die. In other words, don't tell anybody else. And if I might paraphrase, he said, now if the princes come who wanted to kill you, if they come and ask what's going on and what we talked about, and this was part of what they talked about, you tell that you did not want me to turn you over to the house of Jonathan to die, and you tell them that. Well, that was true, but that's not the whole story. That's what Jeremiah told. And so when the princes come, they ask, and so they stop asking because they didn't hear the whole story. And they didn't pursue that any further, and Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. That's where he was when we started at the end of chapter 37. And now we're ready for chapter 39. So what's happened in chapter 38. Jeremiah was thrown into a prison because of false accusation. He was released from that. Zedekiah said, I want to know what the word of the Lord says. And basically Jeremiah said, you don't really care what the Lord says. I've told you and you don't listen. We have confidence in you. But I tell you what, you got a choice. You surrender and it'll go well, and if you don't, it's going to end in disaster. And that's chapter 38. Let's go to chapter 39 now. Chapter 39, what we have is Jerusalem is captured, or the fall of Jerusalem. Now, this is the third invasion. And so this takes place in 586 BC. So if you want to write a date out to the side, it's dated here in the 9th year of Zedekiah, the king of Judah. And in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, all of his army came against Jerusalem and besieged it. This is in 586. They came back. Guess what? Jeremiah was right. And by the way, now I'm going to come back to the by the way. That leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Let's go ahead and get verses 1 to 3, and then we'll come back to the by the way. That in the 11th year and in the 4th month, this would be late June 586, for what that may be worth, that I want you to notice that the city was penetrated. In other words, the wall was penetrated. It wasn't just a siege on the outside of the city, but the city's penetrated and the city falls. So this is the third and final siege of Jerusalem. So this is in 586. This siege lasted 18 months. And so if you want some cross references, 2 Kings chapter 25. If you want to turn over there just quickly, we don't have time to go very far into 2 Kings 25. But if you want to make a note to look at that later, this is when the fall of Jerusalem, this was that third invasion in 586. And I learned from 2 Kings 25 that it lasted 18 months, a year and a half, this siege. And how the temple was destroyed and the temple was burned. They burned the house of the Lord, verse 9. And thus Judah was taken away captive. That is now the final straw of the captivity. Another parallel passage, and this is that kind of by the way thing I was about to mention a moment ago. Chapter 52 seems to be an appendix to the book that basically records, and we'll get to this later, that basically records that, oh, by the way, Jeremiah was right about his prophecies. And so we go back and rehearse this siege again. The fall of Jerusalem is reviewed in chapter 52, and the point again is to demonstrate that Jeremiah's prophecy was fulfilled, and by the way, he was right. So Jeremiah 52 tells us more about this siege, and it lasted 18 months. You see that at verse 4 if you want a reference on that, how they burned the city with fire, and they broke down all the walls, verse 14. So this is that same siege happening right here in chapter 39. So let's see what we have here. Jerusalem fell just as Jeremiah had predicted and told. So verses 1 to 3 we've already covered. The wall was penetrated. The details of that are not given like in 52 or in 2 Kings chapter 25. You can cross-reference those for more details. Now beginning at verse 4, we have they captured and they blinded Zedekiah. Now remember what Jeremiah had been telling them. Don't resist, yield, and it's going to go well with you. Better with you at least. And so what happens? Well, so it was that when Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and all the men saw that they fled and went out of the city, and they went out by the plain. He's resisting. He's not doing what God said. So let's see how that went. Verse 5, the Chaldean army pursued after him, and they captured him, and they brought him to Riblah, which is 75 miles north of Damascus, about 200 miles north of Jerusalem. And they brought him to the king of Babylon, and he met him face to face, as the prophet had said he would do, and there he's pronounced his judgment. Well, let's see what happens here. At verse 6, the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before he put his eyes out. Now you think about that. He took the eyes of, and took Zedekiah's eyes out, blinded him. But the last thing he allowed him to see was killing of his sons. I don't know, but I believe if I was Zedekiah, I wished he took my eyes out first. Well, I didn't see that. The last thing he remembers is him killing his sons. And then he took his eyes out. Here's something I learned, very practical. Sin binds and it blinds. Here's a man who resisted God, and it blinded him and it bound him. Sin will bind you and it'll blind you. How practical that point is. You might circle verse 6 and make a note. That's the last thing he saw. And by the way, that all could have been spared. That could have been spared. Because God had told him through Jeremiah, you just yield and it'll go well for your family. You resist and it's not going to go well for your family. This is going to end in disaster, and it ended in disaster. And so just remember this point, that sometimes when we bring ruin in our family and we watch our children destroyed, that could have been prevented. That could have been prevented. If we just listen to God, that could have been prevented. But we're too stubborn sometimes and we don't want to listen to God, and we're like Zedekiah, we know more, and we're asking, what's the word of the Lord? But then we don't want the word of the Lord. We want to hear what we want to hear and raise our children like we want to raise them, and consequently we watch them being killed before us spiritually, something we could have spared. If we had time, that would preach, I think, but we don't have time to do that. Now, beginning at verse 7, he put his eyes out, and then they took him captive and took him back to Babylon. Now, the Chaldeans burned the king's house and the houses of the people with fire and broke down the walls of the Jerusalem. See, Jerusalem is being utterly destroyed. Jeremiah had said that. And they carried away the captive to Babylon, the remnant of the people, but then they left the poor people back to tend the vineyards and the fields. In other words, to be workers in the vineyards and the fields. And we'll see more about them here in just a second. All right, so Jerusalem falls, the fall of the city, and we see the capture of Zedekiah. Jeremiah is released by the Babylonians beginning at verse 11. Now this is interesting, and there's going to be some conjecture here, that Nebuchadnezzar the king gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, and here's what he said. This is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, said, take him, that is Jeremiah, and look after him and do no harm, but do to him just as he says to you. Now, why on earth is Nebuchadnezzar, this wicked king, showing some favor toward Jeremiah? We're not told exactly. There is some conjecture here, and so I pass the conjecture on. From Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, Jeremiah had been an aid and a help to him because he's telling people to yield to him, yield and surrender to him. So he may view Jeremiah as a friend from that vantage point, or it may be that Nebuchadnezzar, you remember, had some relationship with Daniel particularly, and Daniel is in captivity, that Daniel would have most likely spoke something about Jeremiah, and Ezekiel would have done much the same. He's in captivity. And so while we haven't studied them, they're contemporary with this captivity period that we're in. And so Nebuchadnezzar well could have heard through these prophets who talked to him about Jeremiah being a great prophet and a man who's helping over there, and what he's telling the people is to surrender to you. Whatever the case, you can make up your own conclusion on that, but I think there's good reason to think, to at least make some harmony of why he would show favor toward Jeremiah. So they sent and took him out of the prison and committed him to Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, at verse 14. Now let's stop just for a moment and look back at chapter 26 and in verse 24. I'm not going to turn there. If you want to turn there and trace this, you want to. But Gedaliah's dad had shown favor to Jeremiah a few years before, is what I'm trying to get you to see. And so it's not surprising that Gedaliah shows some favoritism and is kind to Jeremiah. So the text says they took him and he dwelt among the people, and the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah while he was shut up in prison. And so basically the rest of the chapter is he gives a promise to Ebed-Melech, who had spared him out of the dungeon. And here's what he said. He said, made 2 points. He said, my word is going to come upon this city, not for good, for they shall be performed in the day before you, but I will deliver you in that day. In other words, destruction is coming on Jerusalem, but you're going to be spared. Why? Because, look at the end of verse 18, I will surely deliver you, because you have put your trust in me, says the Lord. Here's something very practical. Remember, he was an Ethiopian. He was not of Israel. But he had more confidence in the Lord than some people in Israel. Sometimes people of the world sometimes could show more confidence in what God said than we do. And that puts us to shame. And it did here with Zedekiah. But what a contrast to Zedekiah. Here's Zedekiah the king, who's supposed to be of Israel, and he doesn't trust in God, he doesn't believe in God, doesn't obey God, and here's an Ethiopian. God said, I'm going to spare him because he put his trust in the Lord. Go to chapter 40 now. So what's basically, before we leave this, what's chapter 39 about? Jerusalem is captured, and Zedekiah, it didn't go well because he didn't do what God told him. And if he'd just listened, he could have spared some problem. But it kind of went south for him in a big way. All right, let's go back to our outline because we're shifting gears in the outline. We're still talking about this personal suffering of Jeremiah, but we're now ready to shift gears to after the siege of Jerusalem has fallen, chapter 39. So all this prophecy of Jerusalem is going to fall, that's over. It's done. They fell. Now, chapter 40, we're talking about after the siege and with the remnant. So let's get chapters 40 and 41 in the time we have left and see what we have here. Chapter 40, at the top of your screen here, Jeremiah is set free and he chooses to stay in Judah. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar said, let him go, turn him loose, and he chose to stay for a while. But Jeremiah chooses to stay in Mizpah, as we're going to see. Just before we get much further, here is the city of Jerusalem, right here in the circle, and here's Mizpah just a few miles north of there to give you kind of a perspective of where we're talking. Now, in the confusion of the invasion of Jerusalem, Humphreys makes this point in his, not the little work you have, but his big commentary, that in the confusion of Jerusalem, that Jeremiah is mistakenly taken to Ramah, which is about 5 miles north of Jerusalem. And then he's going to be released. And in other words, he was supposed to be released, but he's taken captive, seemingly. So the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, beginning at verse 1. Let's get verses 1 to 6. He chooses to stay in Mizpah. Came from the Lord, and to let him go from Ramah, which had been taken bound and chained. In other words, again, seemingly in the confusion of the invasion, instead of letting Jeremiah go, they bound him up again and took him off and secured him as a prisoner again. And the captain of the guard took Jeremiah, verse 2, and said to him, the Lord your God has pronounced this doom on this place. And here's what he says. And he says, here's the reason for that. Because you people have sinned against the Lord and not obeyed his voice, therefore this thing has come upon you. Well, he's right about that. This come because you committed sin. Now, he gives him a choice. And I think we have this in our handout, or you're looking for what kind of choice did he have. He said, and now look, I free you this day from the chains that were on your hands. If it seems good to you to come with me to Babylon, come, and I'll look after you. But if it seems wrong to you to come to me to Babylon, then remain here. So all the land is before you. Whatever seems good and convenient to you, go there. In other words, you're free to go wherever. You can go to Babylon with us. You can stay here. You can go anywhere you want to go. You're free. Babylon has turned you loose at the command of the King Nebuchadnezzar. Now look at verse 5. That while Jeremiah had not yet gone back, said to him, go to Gedaliah, whom the king has made governor of the cities, and dwell with him, and if it seems convenient to you to go. So the captain gave his rations and let him go. So he chose to go to Mizpah. Now let's see what happens beginning at verse 7. The dispersed gather around Gedaliah. He's the governor appointed by the king, by King Nebuchadnezzar, that he's going to be the governor in the land. So they gather around him. Gedaliah gives assurance to the remnant. Let's see what that assurance is. Gedaliah gives some assurance that Jeremiah went to Gedaliah. I'm reading at verse 6, and I'm going to skip down now to verse 9. Gedaliah said, by the way, I want to back up, though, to verse 8. Notice one of the men that was in the midst of those that gathered around to Gedaliah to be under his leadership was a man named Ishmael. We don't take note of him just on a cursory reading of that till later, but he's right there in the middle of them. Now, verse 9, Gedaliah said that, "Do not be afraid to serve the Chaldeans, dwell in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you." Well, that's what Jeremiah had been saying. Well, that pledge sounds good, but things are going to turn bad a little bit later. Verse 14, also chapter 41, verses 1 to 10. Things are going to turn south. "But as for me, indeed, I will dwell in Mizpah and serve the Chaldeans who came to us." But then he tells those that were the poor that they were to gather, and they're to gather the wine and the fruit, etc. And so in other words, you work in the land. Well, now then there was a second wave of people coming under Gedaliah. Notice in verse 11 and 12, these are the returning fugitives from, he mentions places like Edom and the Ammonites, etc. People coming from some of the other, had been scattered to some of the other countries. They come to Gedaliah, and all the Jews returned, verse 12, from out of their place. And they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah to gather wine and summer fruit in abundance. So here's the remnant that's coming to the land. Some come back from other places, and some were left in the land and under the leadership of Gedaliah. Things seem to be going well. Now, let's see what happens beginning at verse 13. "There was a man named Johanan, the son of Kareen, and all the captains of the forces were in the fields, and he said to Gedaliah, he said, 'Do you know that the Baalis, the king of the Ammonites, has sent this man Ishmael over here? And that he set out to murder you.'" Now remember verse 8, we saw him over there a moment ago. And the text says, "But Gedaliah did not believe him." Now who is Ishmael? He was part of the royal family. As chapter 41 and verse 1 is going to indicate for us. He's part of that royal family. And he may have been motivated by jealousy, thinking that he should be governor, not king, but governor in the place of Gedaliah. Seemed to be driven by some kind of jealousy, or at least that he's an accomplice for the Ammonites, hoping again to replace Gedaliah with Ishmael. Be that as it may, there's some motive carrying that on. But anyway, verse 15 and 16, and then we're going to go to chapter 41 and wind up. Verse 15 and 16, he said, "Let me go murder him. Let me go kill him. And because he's a threat to you." And Gedaliah basically said, "Oh, you're crazy. That man's not thinking that." He said, "You speak falsely concerning Ishmael. There is no danger. There is no threat. He's not out to get me. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about." And so he ignored the danger. There's something practical in that about ignoring warnings, ignoring danger. All right, now that gets us through chapter 40. So what happened in chapter 40? Jeremiah was recaptured and this confusion taken off north of Jerusalem. He's released. He decides to dwell at Mizpah. He's part of the group that goes under the leadership of Gedaliah. And one in the middle of Gedaliah's group says, "Hey, they're trying to kill you. There's a man here trying to kill you." And he said, "No, he's not. No, he's not." All right, let's go to chapter 41, see if that prediction was right. Let's wind up in chapter 41. We basically have the appointed governor is assassinated and the remnants in trouble. And so chapter 41 is kind of a transition point because that's important to see what happens next week. If we skip chapter 41, didn't even know anything about it, then chapter 42 and 43, when we come to going off into Egypt, we wonder what in the world is going on and why. And chapter 41 is that key that tells us that. But be it as it may, look at verses 1 to 4. Gedaliah and other Jews were murdered by Ishmael, just like he was warned. So it came to pass, the text says, that Ishmael rose up, verse 2, and struck Gedaliah and killed him, whom the king of Babylon had made governor. And he struck down other Jews that were there. And so there's mass murder going on. Now, verse 4 and 5, verse 5 particularly talks about 80 men who had come from Shechem and from Shiloh and from Samaria, who had shaved with their beards shaved and their clothes torn, having cut themselves with the offerings and incense, and they were bringing him to the house of the Lord. Now, the house of the Lord's in shambles, but they're still trying to go make their offering. I don't have time to develop this, but you might take a look at Leviticus 19, 27 and 28, and Leviticus 20 and verse 5, and Deuteronomy 14 and Deuteronomy 16. That chapter 14 and verse 16, but chapters 14 and chapter 16. Humphreys makes the observation that these were pagan practices, and these men had violated the law of Moses, and what they were doing was not in harmony with the will of God, but nonetheless they're coming to the temple. And Ishmael takes them and tells them, come to Gedaliah. And then he kills them, all except for 10. And of those 10, they seem to bribe him. They say, don't kill us because we have treasures of wheat and barley and oil and honey in the field. Some suggest that it's not specifically stated here. Some suggest that when they said we have wheat and barley and oil and then honey in the field, that the wheat and the barley and the oil may have been stashed and hidden somewhere in the city, and don't kill us because we can tell you we've got some stuff hidden here for you and we'll share it with you. That may have been a bribe. Seemingly it was. So he spares them, but he takes the people that are slain and puts them down in the pit. All right, now let's get to the end here, verses 41, chapter 41, 10 to 18. Ishmael is defeated, but then the Jews want to go, and that's the key I want us to get to down at verse 17. That Ishmael started carrying them away to the Ammonites. This is the group that was supposed to be under the leadership of Gedaliah. He's carrying them off to Ammon. And when they took them in, I'm looking for verse 11. When Johanan, that we met a little bit earlier in the context, when he found out, he takes fighting men and they go, he comes and confronts them, and when they see what's going on, Ishmael then, and you're looking for this in your handout, Ishmael escapes and he goes off to the Ammonites. He gets away. He's defeated, but he escapes. He lives. And so they all come back, and now what I want you to get to is verse 17. As they departed, and at the habitation of Kimham, which is near Bethlehem, as they went on their way to Egypt. Why are they interested in going to Egypt? That's their intent. They're not there yet. They're not going yet. They're wanting to go to Egypt. Why? Because of the Chaldeans, for they were afraid of them because of Ishmael. They were afraid of retaliation because of what Ishmael did. He killed his governor. And they were following Ishmael, and they're going on, and so they're afraid of retaliation. So we want to get away. We don't want to be around. We want to be down in Egypt and be under the protection of Egypt. And just keep that in the back of your mind, because Egypt is coming to play in chapters 42 and 43. That ultimately Jeremiah is going to end up there. And we'll see why and how in our next chapters. We won't get into that tonight. So basically what's happened in chapter 42, the appointed governor is assassinated, and now the remnant says, hey, we're fearful, and what in the world is going to happen to us? Let's go to Egypt. And that's where the curtain closes tonight on that story. Now there's several practical lessons. We don't have time to get to them all. Some of them I've already mentioned. But one of the greatest lessons is the choice that's given in chapter 38. If you obey, things will go well. If you disobey, it's going to be shambles for you. And how practical that is. We're going to stop there. That's chapter 41.